Well, I mean, we're only missing one person, so. So defensive skills and strategies, papers due, and your 5th journal entries due. So that's the only two things you got there. Graded all of your offensive skills and strategies, and those went really well. So as long as you kind of apply that same technique to your defensive ones, it should be perfect. All right, so today we get to get into some stuff that I really like, which is our pitching mechanics. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over a whole lot of, like, say, the anatomy and all the movement of the arm and whatnot. And some of this stuff you do need to know. Others, it's kind of above your pay grade, but it's still kind of just good knowledge to have. So I'll make sure to really highlight the stuff that is very pertinent for you to remember, other stuff that's just good. I haven't posted this yet to the announcements, but I'll do that right after class. Okay, you can see here from our shoulder joint, first off, that this really isn't a true joint. So this right here is the head of your humerus, so that is your upper arm bone. This here is what's known as your glenoid fossa. That is part of your scapula or your shoulder blade. And you see how well that sits in there. You can see a very distinct gap this whole way through. There's nothing holding that in place. You have no bony support to it. If you were to look at your hip is a true ball and socket. This part here, which is known as the acetabulum in the hip, is like this. It's like a big cup, and that your head of your femur sticks way in there. Like, it is locked in place. So your hip still has good range of motion, but not nearly as much as your arm. I mean, you kick your leg out to the side, okay, great, I can kick it out that far. Well, I can do that with my shoulder. Your shoulder is your most mobile joint. When you look at movement, you have a continuum here. Mobility versus stability. That says stable. The more mobile you are, the less stable you are. You could pretty much sneeze and dislocate your shoulder, kind of thing. You know, Dwayne Wade in the NBA, I think he's still with the Heat, right? Whatever. All the time, I think he's dislocated his shoulder like 6 or 7 times, something like that. Like, he touches the basketball and it's like his arm pops out of his socket. Your shoulder is inherently unstable. Because it's so unstable, it has the most movement you have. The most stable joint you have are the sutures in your skull. How much do those move? None. Yeah, none. You have a pretty terrible idea if your skull were to move on you. You know, something about like your brain and all that. So that's the first basic tenet of your shoulder, is that it is inherently unstable. So when you lack stability, you gain mobility, and vice versa. Something that would be in the middle would be more like our hinge joints. So say like your elbow and your knee. We'll talk more specifically about those later on. 4 different joints you have. Here's all the bones. You have 3 bones that really primarily make up your shoulder girdle. You have your humerus, your scapula, and your clavicle. So your collarbone, your shoulder blade, and your upper arm bone. Those are the 3 that really make up the entire shoulder joint. All right, this here is a lateral view. So this would be a, you be like looking at the side of me and cutting my arm off that way. This here is your labrum. Your labrum is just a piece of cartilage that's in a almost full circle that just adds depth to that glenoid fossa, or the actual cup that your humerus sits in. And it also acts as kind of a suction cup kind of thing as well. Because it's cartilage, it allows you to have impact against it, so it acts as like a shock absorber or protector. It also acts as a bit of a lubricant against the head of the humerus so that you don't hit that bone on bone bit there, because that's never a good thing. But this often gets injured, or it's one of the most injured soft tissues you'll see in the shoulder. This bit here is also important. This is the head of, or the tendon of your biceps, or long head of your biceps. So your biceps tendon inserts into the labrum. So this is why if you get biceps tendonitis, it's problematic for somebody who throws a baseball, because it attaches to the labrum. Anytime you hear tendonitis, what does that mean?
Something wrong with your tendon?
Well, you're not wrong there. So the suffix itis means inflammation. Tendon, obviously a tendon. So when you have tendonitis, you have inflammation of a tendon. How much room do you have in your shoulder overall? Very little. If something gets inflamed in there, you're pushing on a whole lot of different things that really shouldn't be. You add motion to something that is pushing against something else, and what happens?
It affects a lot of things.
So take your right hand, palm open, take your left hand, put them together, and start rubbing back and forth. And what do you feel?
Friction.
And what does friction generate? Heat, yes. If I were to keep doing this, what would happen?
Yes.
But if I did this like for, say, hours, what's gonna happen to my skin?
It's like that weird, flaky.
You ever worn, like, say, high heels? And what happens if you, like, say, wear a new pair of heels?
It blisters.
There you go. So imagine that's happening inside your shoulder, except instead of getting a blister like on your skin, you're tearing apart your tendons. Not a very good thing to happen, right? So anytime you have any kind of tendonitis or any other inflammation in there, it's really cause for a lot of concern, because you are pushing everything else outward. You generate friction, friction generates heat, heat will end up breaking things down, which you don't want to do. This is all that holds your shoulder in place, soft tissue. You have a capsule, which is a whole bunch of ligaments that almost act as like a mop. So like if you took like a mop and wrung it, that's kind of what your shoulder capsule actually looks like. So if you ever had surgery on your shoulder, and even if you had what's known as a duster, meaning they go in, the surgeon goes in and there's nothing actually wrong, it's still a really damaging procedure, because you have to get through this thick capsule first. Inside there is where you're going to find, your bony structures and whatnot, but this is really everything you have holding you in place. Now, what's also problematic here is this and this, your coracoid process and your acromion process. A process is just a piece of bone that sticks out. So if you feel where your collarbone is and you go over towards your shoulder, where the collarbone goes in, and you'll feel then something kind of jut out, that is your coracoid process. If you go over to your shoulder and come up top to where you feel a bump on the top of your shoulder, that is your acromion process. Relative to where your humerus is, you can kind of see how there's very, very little room there. So this makes it seem like there's all the room in the world, but it's not. Everything is very, very tightly packed together. So any changes in the space you have there, you can see how problematic that can become. All right, the muscles that we work. There's a few muscles you should know. Most importantly is going to be the rotator cuff. If you want to move your shoulder, you have to use your traps. So trapezius is essentially like the grandfather of all shoulder movements. You cannot move your shoulder without traps, at least in some degree, because traps are going to make your scapula move. If your scapula doesn't move, your shoulder really doesn't move in a meaningful way. So your traps go all the way from the top of the base of your head, all the way down to the end of your thoracic spine, so the end of your rib cage. That's where it goes. And then it comes in this big triangle where it inserts all along the side of your shoulder and then on the top of your scapula. So what's known as the spine of your scapula, that's where it's going to insert. These here are your rhomboids. The thing they do is they squeeze your shoulder blades together. Obviously you have pecs. We'll talk about those a little bit later, but pecs are going to be responsible for horizontal adduction, meaning they are going to take your arm and pull it across. Now I know I'm throwing a bunch of terms at you that you may not be familiar with at all, but here's what you should remember, or here's how to remember this. Even if you don't remember the names of a muscle or what the actual term is for the type of movement they do, remember that form follows function. The positioning of our muscles dictates the direction they move. So for example, my thigh muscles are in front of me. Which way do they move me? Forward. They're going to move my leg forward. So anytime I extend my knee or I raise my leg up, my quads are going to contract. How about my hamstrings? Backward. So if I bend my knee or I kick my leg back, my hamstrings contract. If push comes to shove, think of an exercise that you would do that would train these muscles. You have to move the muscles in that direction or else you're not going to actually work them at all, right? What's an exercise you do for your chest?
Flies.
Okay, and how do those look? Perfect. Bring your arm across. Well, what does that also kind of look like in terms of baseball?
Throwing.
Yeah, kind of. So you see how it all works together. When I was a sophomore in college, I remember that's when I first started becoming almost like unhealthily obsessed with my shoulder because I was thoroughly convinced that there was always something wrong with it. And it wasn't until like 3 years later that I was actually proved right. But anyway, one of what I originally thought was like one of my best research papers ever for a I think it was for an athletic training class or whatever. The instructor, who was our head athletic trainer as well, like pretty much tore it to shreds because my whole premise was on increasing the strength of pec major, so your chest, and developing additional external rotation, range of motion for your shoulder to offset the internal rotation you would get from building your chest to improve on pitcher velocity. And his whole thing was that, well, you don't use your chest when you throw, so that's not right. And fundamentally, like that just shows a misunderstanding of how mechanics work, because you have to use your chest to throw, otherwise you can't follow through. Now, granted, I was reaching a bit in terms of what I was actually trying to argue, but his whole counter argument really was something that almost deterred me from the point of like wanting to just like give up on that, the field as a whole. But from that, we'll see that there's different training things we can do and different mechanical things we'll look at that are going to make a big difference for us as we kind of keep developing on here in our understanding of this. Okay, here are the muscles you need to remember. These are your rotator cuff muscles. Your rotator cuff muscles are also known as your sits muscles. Sits stands for supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor, subscapularis. These are the things that actually move your shoulder. Now, this picture again doesn't do them the most justice because it makes them seem like they're huge, and they're really not. They're kind of like paper thin. Like these are very, very small. Some of them are longer, and granted, I have this picture like just long so you can all see it, but they're not that big. So if you figure your shoulder blade is round about the size of, if you go from like tip to tail, like round about the size of your hand-ish, depending, I mean, I guess if you have huge hands, so like that wouldn't work, but if you had a normal size hand, that's about what your shoulder blade would look like if you go from here to here. That's about the size or the length of your rotator cuff muscles, is about that big. But again, that thickness of them is very thin. So what do you think that says about their overall strength?
Well,
Yeah, they're pretty weak, you know, relatively speaking. Your rotator cuff muscles, as a functional mechanism in throwing, are to act as decelerators, meaning they are going to prevent your arm from going out of its socket when you throw a ball. The other thing too with them is that especially when you're training them, you need to train them the same way you would train someone who is a weight class athlete. Meaning you want to develop strength without size. Why would it be a bad idea to bulk up your rotator cuff muscles?
it's hard to get around big muscles, like, especially for pitching, you want to have a really good range of motion.
That's true, but think back to the first thing we talked about with tendonitis.
What is your rotator cuff next to? What is your rotator cuff? Where does it sit?
So there's 4 muscles. They all attach on the pretty much the outside of your shoulder. So they come like this almost. But again, think of tendonitis. If you get tendonitis, you have inflammation of a tendon. If you bulk up a muscle, that muscle gets bigger. Well, that's not unlike tendonitis there, right? You still have that finite space in here. If you bulk those up, it's going to essentially act like tendonitis. Now, what your body does to protect you against that is it has other bigger muscles that take over for you when the load gets too heavy. So it's virtually impossible to bulk them up. Your rotator cuff responds best to 5 pounds of resistance or less. So if you're lifting 20 pounds, you're getting a tiny bit of rotator cuff involvement, but because it's so heavy, you have to kick in your other muscles, your bigger muscles, especially like your major shoulder muscles, your deltoids. Those are going to kick in right away if you lift anything substantial. What can happen if you do like heavy lifting, especially if you do it in a wide range of motion, is that you can actually injure them. So like if you're doing those chest flies and you come all the way down like below chest level or below parallel, now you are overstretching those, and to come back up, your deltoid can't properly function until you hit neutral here. So until I get back to like 90 degrees right here, my deltoid really can't function all that well. So if I'm below here, this is pretty much rotator cuff doing that. And that takes a whole lot of effort for it to work like that because it's not designed to lift anything heavy. And again, heavy is like, you're talking 20, 30 pounds, nothing that would phase most people normally. But if you're lifting incorrectly or going too far towards the end range of motion, that can be like disastrous. Think of it like driving a car. If I'm driving 15 miles an hour, and I'm actually just driving, that's slow, right? If I drive 15 miles an hour straight into a wall, what's that going to do to my car? I mean, I'm going to get a pretty nice dent in there, at least, right? I'm going to cause some damage. Not as much as like if I drove 60 miles an hour into it, but still going to cause some damage. That's why you don't want to be going past parallel for virtually any kind of resistance exercise tailored to your shoulder or tailored to really your upper body as a whole. Now, this here is your most important one. This is your supraspinatus. This here is your subscapularis. This here is teres minor, and this is infraspinatus. Teres minor and infraspinatus are located in your back. So they start on the back of your shoulder blade and they come around to the side of your shoulder. Since they both sit one on top of each other, they do the same thing. They both do external rotation. So they're responsible for doing this. Subscapularis is on the front side of your shoulder blade. So you can't feel it because it's actually inside you deep there. It is responsible for internal rotation. It does this. Supraspinatus is the most important one. It does abduction. It takes your arm out. Abduction is responsible for virtually any pain you would ever have in your shoulder. And again, it's all because of space. So you see here, that's our supraspinatus. This is the overall space we have in here. If I lift my arm up to the side, my bones don't really move, right? So I am depressing or really closing in the space I have there. It's just called an impingement. When you impinge on something, you put pressure on it. This is perfectly normal when you're throwing. If you have any kind of like inflammation in there, however, impingement will happen when you're not throwing or you're not abducting your arm, making things less than optimal in terms of how you feel. There's this thing called the arc of pain. So when you abduct your arm and you get to about 60 degrees, which is about right here. So if this is 0 and I have a 360 degree windmill here, that's about 60. From 60 to about 120 is where you would feel pain if you had an injury or some sort of other pathology in your shoulder. After you get above that, then it kind of clears out. So you don't have to really worry about that. But I don't know how many people are throwing like this, you know? So again, those are your 4 most important muscles that we have there. Supraspinatus is the number 1, that abducts your arm. If I abduct somebody, I take them away. Abduction takes you away from your body. Infraspinatus and teres minor, external rotation. They're located on the back of your scapula or back of your shoulder blade. Subscapularis on the front of your shoulder blade, internal rotation. So external rotation moves backwards. Teres minor and infraspinatus are located on your back, so they move your arm backwards. Subscapularis is on the front of your shoulder blade, does internal rotation or moves your arm forward. Supraspinatus goes actually from your scapula and it goes through your arm here. So it points that way, so it moves your arm that way. So those are the 4 muscles you need to remember. This just shows you the different movements of the scapula. All right, now this here. This is an important thing to understand about just the general movement of the shoulder. This is called scapulohumeral rhythm. And it's probably easiest to just like demonstrate. Can I get you, Nick, to come up here? All right, and you're gonna stand facing the wall. So if I look at him here, he's got his shoulder blade right in here. Okay, pretty simple. So if you just abduct your arm all the way up, and you can kind of see how this is going to rotate over. I go back down. Now, if I go and I hold that in place, now do the same thing. How does that feel?
Crunchy.
You can actually feel that I'm holding this back. So this here isn't rotating out, and it would essentially cause like pain if I got a good grip on there. Could lock that in place. Thank you. So to actually achieve this full range of motion, so that you don't completely impinge everything, you need your arm to work with your shoulder blade to make it move. It works in a 2-to-1 ratio. You can only move your arm 120 degrees. So if I didn't have a shoulder blade at all, I'd be able to move my arm this high. I couldn't go any higher. Because if I didn't have a shoulder blade here, the head of the humerus would run into my clavicle. So it would hit that, and I'd be stuck. I wouldn't be stuck, but I couldn't go forward. I'd be banging bone on bone then. You would literally feel it lock in place. So I have my shoulder blade rotate along with that. So for every 2 degrees of abduction I do, so every 2 degrees that I bring my arm out, I get 1 degree of my scapula tilting to help facilitate that full 180 degrees. That kind of make sense? Force coupling just means that you have many movements in different directions that all give you one basic movement. So if I'm driving a car, and I'm going forward, my tires are moving in 4 different directions to produce that movement. The front of my tires move down, the bottom of my tires move backwards, the back of my tires move up, and the top of my tires move forward. 4 different movements, but they all combine to make one single movement forward. That is what a force couple is. So to get, say, your shoulder blade to move, you get muscles on the bottom to pull left and right. You get muscles on the top to pull left and right. And you get muscles in the center to kind of tilt you up, down. You combine those together. So if I take my pop bottle and I take the top and I pull it this way, and I take the bottom and I pull it that way, it's going to spin because they're both going in opposite directions. If they were both going in the same direction, I couldn't move it with any rotational force. The only time you can do that is if you like squeeze your shoulder blades together, or if you bring your arms out in front like you're hugging someone or yourself, or if you try to, say, like push out or pull back. That's how you would get those different single degree movements. All right. How do you all feel about your anatomy? What are your majors?
I'm psych with emphasis in sports performance, but that's just for right now. Who knows?
Okay.
Business admin.
All right. So, fairly diverse population here. Have any of you taken anatomy? You have? Oh, well done. So this is all like a review for you. That's great. That's awesome. So yeah, I don't expect you to have this down pat because this is stuff you would spend semesters on, not 20 minutes. But if you can remember your sits muscles, that'll be a big win because those are the most important things we have in terms of our arm. Now, getting into our actual mechanics here. When we talked about, like, say, mechanics of the swing, like a baseball swing, it's virtually the same with the pitching motion in that you do have a relatively set type of perfect mechanics that will deviate slightly based off of style, body structure, different little tiny things. What I'm not going to really cover here is people who have grossly variable arm angles. So if you have a non-traditional arm angle, such as somebody that throws a submarine ball or a sidearm person, I'm not really going to cover that too much because that's more of a niche topic than it is something you would study to, like, say, teach mechanics like proper. And I'm not gonna lie, I would not know how to teach somebody to throw a submarine ball. When I tore my rotator cuff after my senior year, well, technically after my 5th year, I pitched all of like 2 innings that summer, and I could throw a submarine ball because I tore my supraspinatus. So remember, supraspinatus does what? What movement?
Internally rotate.
No.
Just kidding. Oh, this one?
Yes, abduction. So if you tear your supraspinatus and you reach 60 degrees, yeah, that's going to hurt. So yeah, that hurt. So what I did was I would pitch like this. No abduction, no pain. And actually it was pretty effective because when I was throwing from down here, the ball would rise and then drop. So it almost looked like I was throwing like a rise ball in softball. So that was kind of neat there. I was probably also throwing about 20 miles an hour slower than what I would normally do, but you know, beggars can't be choosers. So we're going to be looking at the traditional overhead throw because that's just what the majority of people do. All pitching involves these same 6 steps. You have your wind up, early cocking, late cocking, acceleration, deceleration, follow through. I'm actually not sure who this is. I've been trying to look this up because I kept thinking it was Mike Leake, and it's not.
Kind of looks like it.
It does. But he's wearing the number 43, and he never wore 43 for Cincinnati. he wore 44. So I'm not quite sure. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. The other guy that I possibly think it could be is Jimmy Haynes. But when he threw at his first balance point, he did this. So I don't know. But
It's like a 2000s uniform.
yeah, oh, it definitely is, yeah. All right. Your windup is everything that you do from being set to getting your leg in the air. You'll see some pitchers that throw a traditional windup where they have both feet on the rubber. They will stare straight at the batter and they'll do some sort of step, pivot, and then up. You'll see others that will go from the stretch, meaning that they put one foot or their back foot on the rubber, stand perpendicular to the batter, perpendicular to the batter. Sorry, parallel, perpendicular to the batter. They're parallel to the batter, and just go straight to here. You don't ever want to go from the windup when you have runners on base. Why is that?
Takes way too long.
Yeah. So if I stand both feet on the rubber and I take a step and then I have to pivot and then go up, that takes time. Runners are kind of fast, so they will steal bases rather freely if you do that. So part of the style bit is if you were talking about going from this windup or if you're going from what we call the stretch. That's more stylist points there. They're not, you don't have any significant differences in speed or velocity between the two. So for simplification, we're going to view everything from the stretch, meaning that you're starting in the position where you have one foot against the rubber and you are parallel to the batter. So I'm like this, and I would go straight into my leg lift. A drill you may see done to help reinforce this initial windup phase is just a simple balance drill where pitchers will just stand like this and just try to hold their balance. And I never really understood that because pitching is a very fluid motion. Yes, if I had to stand like this during the actual pitching motion, that'd be very beneficial. But it's kind of teaching you to not use momentum to your advantage. So I never really quite got that. I could see if you were trying to correct a deficiency. So for example, if you say were to lift your leg and you were to like kick back, or if you were to lean way forward, something where you were like inherently off balance, I could see that helping. But just as a drill to help you balance better, that really does nothing for you. Now, when you get to early cocking, that's when you get to this second picture here. Think like you're cocking a gun. You are loading it, getting it prepared to shoot. With your arm, you cock your arm by bringing it back. So you start out here, and then as your leg goes down, your hands should separate at the same time. So leg goes down, hands separate, leg comes out. Notice though his foot is still in the air and his arm is back. So lead foot in the air, arms back, early cocking. During your late cocking, you'll now have the foot landing and you'll be getting into max external rotation. So you will come down, land, external rotation. Acceleration then takes you from external rotation to internal rotation right to the point of release. And then deceleration is right after you release. Follow through is then when the ball is, or when you're finishing the final pieces of the motion. There's a couple things to keep in mind with this. First off is really your laws of motion. So I don't know if did we talk about Newton's third law of motion here? So Newton's third law is equal and opposite forces. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. This is why you don't want to have super strength, because if I punch a wall, the wall punches me back with the same force I exert into it. So unless you had like, you know, invulnerability, you would essentially like shatter your body if you had super strength kind of thing. What this means for us in a practical sense is how you land. So if you notice, he's landing here somewhat on his heel, but more flat-footed. What direction is the force of the ground going to push back up on you if you land flat-footed?
Straight up.
Straight up. That's very important. Why? What you never want to happen is you never want the ground to push back at you. If I land on my toe, the ground pushes straight back at me. If I land on my heel, the ground pushes straight back at me. Although, if you land on your heel, it's slightly better. Why would that be?
Because you're rolling into the motion.
Yes. So if I landed on my heel, I still have the rest of my foot to go and land, and I can use momentum to drive me forward. Less of a problem. If I'm on my toe, I'm at the end of my foot. I can't roll my foot any farther forward. The only thing I'm gonna do is push myself backward. There's several big things with pitching that will be huge red flags. The number one thing with the lower body is the landing. If you land anything other than roughly flat-footed, and especially if you land anything forward, closer to the ball of your foot or even on your toes, that is extremely problematic because it's pushing you backwards. Now, if you were running, yeah, you want to land on the ball of your foot because you want to have a short transition or amortization phase. But in pitching, because I'm only taking one step, landing on the ball of my foot is very bad. And I think I was telling you before, like this is one of the things I saw with Pearson, was that in some of his still images, I would see him landing almost like on the ball of his foot, which is going to be taken away, I would estimate roughly on average 1 to 3 miles an hour from his fastball. So he's not too far out. And granted, this was 2018, I think.
19.
Oh yeah, it would have been 2019. So, I mean, he could have changed, but this is something I noticed. So maybe keep an eye out. Even though we have these 6 basic steps to this, it's all fluid. So it's not as though you want to necessarily separate one thing into the next. You can, if you take still images, but it's all fluid. If you're looking at a pitcher's mechanics as a whole, if it doesn't look right, like if it doesn't look natural, it probably isn't right. With most movements, things that don't look right tend to not be right. Now again, like there's exceptions based on arm angle, like I was talking about. If you had a submarine thrower or if you're a sidearm thrower, they're different. We're not talking about them. But yeah, it looked as though like something just didn't look right. Most likely you're correct. My hope is to be able to like say videotape you all and then actually be able to do a mechanical analysis with you, but I don't particularly see that happening anytime soon. Yeah, so let's just go ahead and break this down kind of from a fundamental standpoint here. So I want to show you this video here with Drew Storen. So he's a pitcher for the Washington Nationals. This starts out with him just lifting his leg like that. That is his windup right there. Now, for him, it's much more stylistic than anything. But you see how you don't necessarily have to have a huge leg kick or a huge knee lift to really get you going. What's the whole point of having this wind-up phase? Like, why do you lift your knee at all?
Get out of the way for your back to work.
That is true. What else?
In a wind-up versus a stretch, you mean? Or in general?
In general, it's the same thing.
Because you have to stride.
You do have to stride, that is true. It builds momentum. That's the main thing. Whenever you talk about building speed, are you going to run faster or reach top speed if I tell you to run 10 yards or if I tell you to run 60 yards?
60.
Why?
Because you usually don't hit full speed until a little later.
Yes, exactly. The whole point of moving the leg is to generate distance. Momentum and distance will give you more opportunity for a longer time, meaning that I have a longer opportunity to reach maximum speed. Now, granted, you're not trying to like rush your leg out or anything like that, but you're generating more momentum for the rest of your body to happen, or the rest of the motion to happen. Pitching, hitting, all works on the same energy transfer principle of your kinetic chain. Your kinetic chain works bottom to top. You generate energy or force from your feet and transfer it upward. You can test this by, first off, if I just take a ball and throw it like this, how hard can I throw it like that? Then you go from the side and you move your trunk, and then you step and throw. And if you really want to do it, you can take like a big old crow hop kind of thing and just launch your body into it. But the more you get your legs involved, the more force that's generated, the higher the velocity. The internal rotation you have in your arm is the fastest movement in sports. It's at about 8 to 12,000 RPMs. That doesn't mean anything if you don't have adequate force production coming from the bottom up. This is why if you look at a pitcher's body, he does not have a huge upper body, but he's, relatively speaking, pretty sturdy on the lower half. And that is completely by design. Remember, what is the overall characteristic of your shoulder joint? What does it do? What does it do that, say, your skull doesn't do? Moves a lot, right? Mobility is the big characteristic of your shoulder. Do you want to hinder that movement? No. And if I'm generating force from the bottom top, what muscles are stronger in your body?
Your legs.
Your legs, yeah. I mean, I don't know about you, but if you put 500 pounds on a bench press, I'm going to laugh at you and not even attempt it. If you put 500 pounds on like a leg press, I might give that a go. I know in my playing days, I could do around there for a leg press without much issue. My best ever that like in shape I was, like strongest I ever was, I was doing like 2 to 3 sets of 6 to 8 reps of 225 pounds on the bench press. Not even half of what I could do easily at the time for my legs. So, I mean, not trying to do a humble brag there, but it just shows you though that your lower half is so much more powerful than your upper half. We've talked about, or we mentioned the term range of motion. What does that actually mean?
The distance a certain part of your body can travel.
Yeah, how much total movement you have. That's it. Range of motion is especially important for the shoulder, not so important for really anything else. It helps to have additional range of motion in the rest of your body, but if you can't transfer that energy, the additional range doesn't mean anything. Range of motion in your shoulder, and we'll look at this in a minute, should be around about 180 total degrees. So between external rotation and internal rotation, this should be about 180 degrees total. And we'll cover some more of that a little bit later. But all right, let's getting back to this here. Now, you notice as his front leg starts going forward or drops down, his hands separate. Once his arm gets back into here, that is early cocking. You'll also notice that you almost always keep a straight line between your glove side and your arm side, or your throwing side. So he throws across his body. You can tell, even though this is from the side view, because his right leg is all the way over there. If I drew a straight line, it would come roughly to here. His left leg is over here. So if my left leg comes over here, to finish my throw, I have to bring my right leg over to the side. This isn't the most mechanically sound thing to do, but what is the potential advantage to that?
Not being on that side of the rover?
Yeah,
You get a little bit extra torque.
you could, yeah. So imagine that you're the batter and I'm throwing to you. So I'm trying to hit the chair that's in between you two. If I throw straight forward, that ball comes, you know, relatively speaking there. If I cross over,
For angle,
where does the ball look like it's going?
straight ahead.
Exactly. But when he actually throws it, where is he throwing it to?
Between us.
Yeah. And because he's a major league player, he's pretty decent at it. The way that looks to a batter, especially, you know, more of a novice batter, is, oh my God, that ball's gonna hit me. You have this big crossover here. Another player that used to do that was Tom Corsair, but he was a left-handed pitcher. But if you step over, you create the illusion that the ball is coming farther at you than what it really is. So it's just a deceptive practice. It can be very effective. I mean, Tom Corsair had like a, I don't know, 10, 15 year major league career. He never threw faster than like 90 miles an hour. And he was a very serviceable guy. Only problem is that when you do something like this, it tends to really bother your shoulder long term. And you also mentioned more torque. We'll see when he does his actual rotation here, his trunk rotation, how that plays, because that does play a major role in this. So if I were looking straight at him right now, if you were looking straight at him right now, he would look like this. So you would see the ball behind him. I'm kind of over-exaggerating here, but you get the idea. But still, his arms are in a straight alignment, regardless. You're not going to see a perfect 180 degrees, but you want, relatively speaking, to stay in a straight alignment between the elbows. So elbows should stay at approximately a straight line. What you don't want to see is essentially your glove arm here. So like if I was have my hand pointed out at you and his back hand like this. That's what you don't want to see. All right, let's look at his foot landing. All right. He hits with that heel first. And that's okay. Because again, even though he's got that ground force pushing back up at him, he's going to have that forward roll to build further momentum. So that's still okay. The major thing, again, with the foot landing is what? What do you not want to do? You don't want to land on the front of your foot. That is the worst thing you can do. You have no way to correct that. If you're flat-footed, you're good. If you're on the heel, you're okay. If you're on your toe, you're bad. Now, you notice that he is starting to rotate here. His front foot, or his left foot, where's that pointing? Straight away. What would happen if he had that foot externally rotated? So if he had it open.
His hip will be open.
Yeah, his hips will be open. If your hip opens, what do you lose?
Power.
Torque. Very good. If I lose torque, I then can't generate power or force. So you want to land with your foot pointing either straight forward or slightly closed off. Because if you open up your hips before your trunk is ready to rotate, then you're going to lose all of that lower body energy. Your trunk is the only thing that matters in terms of transferring energy from the lower half to the upper half. You can generate all the power in the world from your legs, but if you can't transfer it up to your arm, it means nothing. Your trunk is the bridge that connects the two. Another thing too is look how he lands with that front foot or that front leg. Sorry, I was trying to, there we go. Red's probably a better color. Why is it important that that leg's bent or his knee's bent?
If you have your full pitching force and you land with a straight leg, you're probably going to break it. Or, I mean, you have to soften your landing.
Yeah, I mean, you probably wouldn't break it, but yeah, it's going to not feel right, to say the least. But it's also going to just essentially jam that energy or that force from your leg straight up. So it actually causes you to shoot up energy up from your lower half to your upper half before you need to. So again, it's wasteful. And try it for yourself sometime. Walk with your legs straight and see how that feels. So keep the knees straight or completely extended and see how you do with it. Now, when this foot lands, we see that this foot now has his heel off the ground, toe still on the ground. When you're doing this, you need to raise your heel first before you raise your toe. This is to allow clearance for you to rotate. If you can't rotate the backside, you can't rotate the trunk. If you can't rotate the trunk, you can't generate force from the bottom to the top, and the kinetic chain is broken. So I have to bring my heel up because that's the only way it's going to give me clearance to move. If he kept his foot completely on the rubber, how would he rotate? He wouldn't. What you'll see happen with players who have a difficult time with rotating their backside is they will kind of be deceptive about it. They will throw, and then they will pick their foot up and turn it. So they'll actually pick the whole foot up while it's still parallel to the to home plate, and then rotate in the air. Well, if I turn in the air, how much force can I generate?
None.
Virtually none. You know, it's like if you jump from the ground, you can jump relatively high, I would think. If you're already in the air, how much farther can you jump? Yeah, exactly.
Pretty cool.
Do like the video game thing, the double jump. This is the same thing with batters too. A batter has to lift their back heel before they rotate. So you'll see that there's a ton of analogies between the two. What's really nice here is that we could see his belly button. That is important because it shows that his trunk is still closed, or his hips are still closed. When that's still closed, that means he is still holding in energy from his lower side, or he has force still stored in his lower half. This should be the last thing to come through. You need your arm to catch up to this before you want that to go. What he's demonstrating with his upper half here is a W. And there's a lot of debate on what this actually means to not only velocity, but also shoulder health. What the technical term for this is called is scapular loading. So what he's doing is he's squeezing his shoulder blades together before throwing. So what he's trying to do is create a pre-stretch with his rhomboids, or the muscles that are going to pull your shoulder blades towards your spine. And then doing that will inactivate them when you go forward. So it allows you to have greater movement forward with less resistance pulling you back. But there's a lot of debate on whether that's even effective or how much that can actually potentially even hurt you. Someone that used to do that a lot was Mark Pryor, and he was one of like the original phenom from like the 90s. He played at USC, drafted, I think he was like, I don't know, was he #1 overall? I think, something like that. It was like in 96, 97, something like that. Came into the league through like a 20 strikeout game, like in his first season, all-star, all that, and then just injuries derailed the rest of his career. Like it was a complete flame out just from injuries. And he threw like this. And so that was one of the big debates is that really even effective? So.
I throw like that.
Not too much. You're definitely not.
You've only seen high school videos.
Well, no, I've looked at, well, at least the still images they showed of you.
Okay.
And it doesn't look like you go that far. The problem with it is with the right shoulder. Bringing the right shoulder like this, like if you overdo it, and then rotate. If you're rotating too early before you start external rotation, you create anterior shear force on the front of your shoulder. So a shear force is a force that goes like this. So you'd be pulling your torso this way where your shoulder is going that way, That's creating that shear force. It's very bad. It's like you tear a piece of paper, very easily tears if you do that. So that's where the problem can lie, is that that longer distance, which would be used to generate more speed, can also be a double-edged sword there by creating that excessive amount of force or pressure on the shoulder, in the front of the shoulder specifically. You ever had any shoulder problems?
Always elbow guy.
It's not a bad thing. If I'm gonna hurt something, I hope it's my elbow. Look at his head. Now, granted, he's got, in the shadows there, but what's that saying about his head right there?
It's in the center of your body.
It's not gonna move.
Well, yeah, what's he looking at?
Measure.
Yeah. He's keeping a line of sight to his target. You do not want to lose line of sight. If you lose line of sight, you lose proprioception. So real quick, everybody stand up. And are you all right-handed?
Yes.
Okay, so you're gonna stand on your left foot, bring your right leg up. Relatively easy, okay? Feet down, close your eyes, right foot up. Yeah, how easy is that?
No.
Yeah, exactly. That's why you always want to keep line of sight. Proprioception is how you tell your body's relative positioning in space. If you can't see, you can't orient yourself. This is why, like, if you ever close your eyes and walk, all of a sudden your walking becomes very unsteady, even if you're on a straight path. You'll even notice, like, if you were walking even on a treadmill, where you're just same straightforward motion. If you close your eyes, you'll start veering one side or the other. And it's because you have no way to orient yourself. It's also why you get seasick, if you ever do. It's because you're not able to orient yourself to the horizon. So keeping line of sight, very important. Notice his hand is turned away. So I only see the back of his hand there. Now, as we come through into right here, well, first off, right here is our early cocking, where he has raised his arm up. He's now starting to turn his hand over. Late cocking, right there, is when he gets into max external rotation. So we're going to keep this as a marker right here. But now, look where everything is. He has rotated his back foot. He has rotated his trunk. Everything is facing forward. Everything's in alignment there. Perfect, right where you want to be. His hand is still facing away from us, which is perfectly normal. You don't want to catapult the ball. So you don't want your hand to be essentially like this. You want it to be facing away because this allows you the opportunity to have internal rotation later. So that ball is actually going to mostly face the pitcher until it's released. So you'll see when he releases that, he turns his hand inward quite a bit, which we'll look at here next. There it is. That is your max internal rotation. And I wish I had a way to tell the exact amount of time this all takes. Like be able to count the frame by frame. But if you can kind of tell for yourself, Look how fast it takes him to get external rotation versus how fast he goes to internal rotation. It kind of seems like the camera speeds up there, doesn't it? And that's just kind of a way to illustrate to you how much faster your internal rotation is than anything else. So at this ball, whoops. When he gets to ball release there, he's starting, and now right there he finishes. There we go. So now, if we take our line and draw it, you see how that is approximately 180 degrees. That is exactly what your body likes. So, internal rotation, then at ball release, we're at reaching in acceleration. After he throws the ball, we get to deceleration now, and then into your follow through. Ooh, and there's a nice little tidbit here at the end. So first off, the whole reason why you have a follow through is to dissipate energy. It means that when you've released the ball, you've released it with the full force you have, and then it takes you time to slow down. If you were to stop, like if he were able to just stop on a dime after he released it, he would have to have slowed down to the release point. So you're not throwing at max speed. Watch his throwing hand, what it does at the very end here. It's pretty subtle, but he slightly recoils. Now, I've seen players do this where it's like terribly obvious. It's not so bad here. By recoiling, what's happening is you are pulling back as if you're going to throw again. You're almost going to rewind. What's happening there is that when you throw, you want to dissipate all of that energy forward and then down. So especially with your throwing arm, you want to dissipate all that. If I try to pull back, I'm now fighting against that force I've originally created. So it's kind of like if you're trying to go out into the ocean and you're trying to walk through a wave. The wave is going to push you back, but you're trying to go through it. It takes a lot of force to get through that. If you are generating that force in this direction, and then you try to pull back this way, you're forcing your shoulder to work harder than what it really should. So that can be potentially problematic. A guy I played summer ball with, gosh, it would have been like 10 years ago now. He pitched for Ohio State, and tiny little kid, who's like 5'7", like 140 pounds, just chucking it at like 92, like an anomaly of a guy. But, I mean, he had very, very solid mechanics, like perfect mechanics until he got to his follow through. He would do this. It was crazy. It was like he spring loaded it from his, left pocket straight back up every single time over and over again. And unsurprisingly, he ended up blowing his shoulder out. Because even just do that for yourself. So just stand up and just even stay straightforward, throw and then pull back. But pull back real quick. And what do you feel? Yeah, that doesn't feel the greatest, does it? Again, you are putting much more shear force onto your shoulder than we want. There's two types of forces that are very, very bad for you. Shear forces and torsion forces. Torsion is when you do a opposite rotation. So it'd be like if you gave someone an Indian burn. That is a torsion force. A shear force is when you have a straight line going opposite directions. So torsion forces will happen between the shoulder blade or the glenoid fossa where the humerus sits in. When that rotates externally and the humerus rotates internally, it'll do that. All right, so do you see the basic foundation we have? Oh, and for the follow through too, nice flat back, leg now straight, this leg bent up. Again, all about dissipating energy. There is debate on whether a completely flat back is necessary. It's debatable, research is mixed on it. But you at least have a general idea of what the mechanics kind of look like initially. We'll definitely do more with this, but just wanted to kind of introduce you to that right now. All right, these are just kind of some different structural anomalies. We kind of talked about this, but if you have a hooked or a curved acromion, it potentially could lead to more problems because it has less space in there overall. Leg length, if your leg length changes, it can affect how much shear force gets put on your shoulder depending on what you can do in terms of stride length and trunk rotation. All right, this is the more important thing though. 10, 15, even 20 years ago, this word GERD was thrown around as though it was the next best thing since sliced bread. GERD stands for glenohumeral internal rotation deficit, meaning how much internal rotation range of motion do you lose from throwing? Research has shown conclusively that right-handed pitchers lose more internal rotation than left-handed pitchers do. However, we're finding that it really doesn't matter. So, do you ever do the internal rotation stretch? You lay down on your side, arm like this, and pull your arm forward. That's really not all that beneficial for you. I mean, if it feels good, do it. I mean, if you personally feel like you're gaining something out of it, I mean, go for it. But what can potentially happen there is that you can create additional laxity or looseness in that shoulder, which you don't want to do. It's already unstable enough. You don't want to help it out. What's more important, and again, this is really specific to just baseball pitchers, is that 180 degrees of total rotation. So the blue lines here represent external rotation. The whatever color this is, yellowish, represents internal rotation. It really doesn't matter which one is which. What really matters is that you keep this 180 degrees. That's the much more important thing. Where you become problematic is when you have big drop-offs or big changes either way in that total range of motion. Now, yes, there is kind of a minimum you need to hit. Like if I were to just start here and somehow throw with 180 degrees of internal rotation, I'm not going to do so well. So you do ideally want to get to at least 90 degrees of external rotation. You will never be able to get this much external rotation on your own. Like you can't sit there and move your arm back that whole way just like that. You use momentum and then use force production to do it. Otherwise you wouldn't be able to get there. you should be able to get to full internal rotation. So at least 90 degrees. So if this is 0, 90 would be if I was straight back. That's where you approximately want to be. When I, after I injured my shoulder and I started my return to throw program, I was in awesome shape. My external rotation was approximately right here. I was at around about like 20 degrees. A far cry from 90. So even though my body was completely healed, after surgery, I lost virtually all my range of motion. My internal rotation was fine. Like that was still roughly in like the 70, 80-ish degree range. That was good. I've always been a person that had problems with external rotation. Well, remember again, external rotation, form follows function. What do you think is kind of lacking if you have external rotation issues?
Muscles in your back.
Yeah, exactly. The basic tenet of every single pitching program needs to be that you need to develop a posterior dominant shoulder. The front of your shoulder is not that strong. And whenever you hurt your shoulder, you almost 90% of the time are going to hurt the front or the side. It's very difficult to hurt the back of your shoulder. I mean, it happens, but much more rarely. So when you look at any kind of throwing specific program, the goal should be to generate or to create a posterior dominant shoulder. If I can put more emphasis on the back of my arm, which is much stronger and much more secure than the front, I then take all that strain, or at least most of that strain, off of the front of my shoulder. So see how that's beneficial. So how do you do that? Well, when you're doing any sort of, first off, strength training, you need to remember a 3-to-1 ratio. 3 back exercises for every 1 chest exercise. That's the first thing. You also want to work on functional movements. So a thing called PNF, or proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation, we talked about that for our stretching. That is very beneficial to do for your rotator cuff. Additionally, your rotator cuff exercises. So luckily I have a band here because sometimes you just gotta wake them up. Whenever you're, and this is actually too heavy for my rotator cuff, because I think this is like 20-ish pounds or something like that of resistance. So you want to, again, be doing 5 pounds. So for bands, typically that's like green or red. Typically the lighter colors are the easier ones. And there's a series of movements you would want to do. If I had this secured to something, I would be doing external rotation. I would be doing internal rotation. I would want to do external rotation in a perpendicular position. However, many people will do that like this, and that is not correct. This promotes impingement. When you do that, and it's easiest to do with 2 dumbbells. So I got my dumbbells here. What you want to do is squeeze your shoulder blades together and come at a W. So you actually want to drop your elbows down to do standing external rotation. Remember, if I don't go into abduction, I can't impinge my shoulder. So now I'm still doing the exact same thing without the impingement. Much more effective. In terms of, say, overall volume you want to do, you know, when you do a round of rotator cuff exercises, how many reps do you do?
Like 15, but it's always less, 5 pounds or less.
You're talking about each exercise or your whole program?
Like our shoulder program,
Yeah.
we do these, and then this kind of stuff, and it's all 15 each.
Okay, so you're like 45 to 60 reps for like a
Closer to 60, yeah.
for like a given set. Yeah, that's about right. How many pitches does a pitcher have to throw in a game?
Starter,
Sure.
upwards of 100.
Okay. Does that take a lot of time?
Yeah.
Kind of, right? When you're throwing, you are using what is known as anaerobic endurance. Each individual pitch is less than a second. Actually, it's roughly about 1.5 seconds. Average major league pitcher has a release time or a total time of lifting their leg up to throwing from the stretch to the home plate about 1.53 seconds. Don't ask me how I know that, but I did look it up. That is super quick. However, how much time does it take between pitches?
20-ish,
yeah. I know there's the timer now in Major League Baseball. Is it 20 seconds in Major League? Do they do that in college?
now they do.
Okay. So 20 seconds from the catcher throwing the ball back to the pitcher to when the next pitch has to be delivered.
When there's a guy on base.
Okay.
Or sorry, when there's not a guy on base.
Okay.
When there's someone on base, you can take however long you want.
Let's just say 30 seconds then to cover everything. That's a pretty good amount of time to recover. Now, you're never going to truly get back to 100% the minute you start doing anything at a max effort. So it's going to take, not only time to get your stamina back, but also for your shoulder recovery. Needless to say, it's still anaerobic endurance. Since it's kind of difficult to train your muscles for anaerobic endurance without bulking them up, you have to do the next best thing, which is muscular endurance for any of your resistance training for your shoulder. The only way you can increase volume without increasing weight is to increase repetitions. So typical rotator cuff exercises, you're going to see, 10 to 20 repetitions for 3 to 5 sets. Now, like Nick was pointing out, he does this. All right, so forward flexion, scaption, abduction, 15 reps each. You see how that's 15, 30, 45 for a single set. And how many sets are you doing?
We also do external.
Okay.
And then laying on the bench doing more stuff, but usually one set.
Okay, that's fine. But you see how the total repetitions are huge compared if you were doing, say, bicep curls. How many of those would you do?
No more than like 10.
Sure. Something much smaller. Now, one of the things to really keep in mind when you're talking about mechanics is how the overall anatomy of the shoulder plays in. I told you earlier how, like say, the long head of the biceps attaches to your labrum. Your labrum is that piece of cartilage that insulates or helps to support the shoulder itself. So things like training your biceps can actually be very beneficial for you for helping you strengthen that area. Even if you bulk your biceps, it's still going to bulk down here. And that also may be beneficial because it could actually limit range of motion for elbow flexion, meaning it wouldn't allow you to do something like this, where you would actually lose a lot of force production. That can also strengthen your elbow, and we haven't talked about the elbow yet, but we'll get into that next time. And that can also be really beneficial to prevent from any elbow injuries. You're only ever going to hurt the inside of your elbow. So your UCL or ulnar collateral ligament, it's actually 3 ligaments that form like a triangle. Those are the ones that keep your elbow in place and prevent it from dislocating laterally. doing something like bicep curls, or even another thing too, anecdotally, that'll really help is bowling. If you bowl and you throw a hook, it'll actually really, really strengthen your forearms and your elbow. So the more you can take stress off your shoulder and put it down your arm, the better. Now, if you injure an elbow versus injuring a shoulder, if you injure a wrist or a forearm versus an elbow, it's all kind of the same. They're all pretty bad injuries. But your elbow recovers a lot better than your shoulder. Your forearm recovers better than your elbow. Your wrist recovers better than your forearm. It's all because there's more structural support the farther down you go. All right, so we are about at time. So that's everything I kind of wanted to cover here today. Now, obviously next week, we are not going to be meeting because, you know, Thanksgiving. I'll probably post a video for you so you can look over, and I'll give you a BLA for next week for, you know, something to do. And then in 2 weeks, we will meet back. So right now we are in week 11, I believe. Yeah. So next week's Thanksgiving is 12. So then we only got 3 weeks left. And then the last two major things you're going to do are you're going to do a coaching presentation. So that is going to be, you're going to teach me how to throw, and you're going to teach me some other skill. And then you get your final, and your final is just going to be everything from hitting and base running on. So I'm going to put more of an emphasis on 7 through 12, because everything here, 13, 14, 15 is more geared towards your presentation than anything. So most of the content is going to be based on 7 to 12. All right, so if you don't have any more questions, you guys are all good to go. I hope you have a happy Thanksgiving. Stay safe, and I will see you all in 2 weeks.